J. Edward Chamberlin is fascinated by stories and storytellers. That fascination has taken him around the world, from the indigenous peoples of North America to the hunters of the Kalahari and the herders of Mongolia. 20 years ago, he wrote, "If this is your land, where are your stories? Finding common ground." Now he's just written another book on the topic. Here to talk about storylines, how words shape our world, is Ted Chamberlin. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Now, to me, storylines is kind of like a TED talk about the power of stories and storytelling. Is that what you were going for here?
In ways, yes. I mean, the stories shape our lives. It's simple as that. We learn about things through stories. We tell about things that have happened to us in stories. And I've been working with stories. I taught for 40 years, taught literature at the University of Toronto. That's stories and songs. And I also worked very closely with Indigenous people on land claims, and those are stories and songs. And I realized all too recently that I didn't really know a lot about how stories work, what makes them work, what makes them gives them the extraordinary power they have over us and with us, and what they do to help us. So that's where the book emerged, came from. I thought I knew how stories work, and I quickly discovered that I didn't. A couple of years later, I hope I'm getting somewhere.
One of the things you say you try to do with the book is to show how storytelling helps us illuminate the wonders of our world. How do you think it does that?
Well, I think it does that from very early days. It helps us understand that we live with and live in contradictions and uncertainties. And that begins with Once Upon a Time, which we recognize quite quickly when we're really young means right now. And the storytelling traditions of the world all signal the kind of ceremony of storytelling with something like that introduction. In Majorca, traditional storytellers start with a phrase that means it was and it was not. In the Southern Kalahari, where I was working, they use a word, larube, which means the happening that's not happening. And all of that, Dan Yashinsky, who's a very fine storyteller in Toronto, tells of his grandmother, what his grandmother used to say. She says, I'm going to tell you about something that happened. If it hadn't happened, how could I tell you about it? And then she'll go along to tell a scary story, a wonderful story, an imagined story. But that's what we do, and that's how we live our lives. One of the ways I start the book, is with a story about a gathering of Rastafarian elders in Jamaica that I was very, very privileged to help organize with a man named Mortimer Plano. Mortimer Plano was Bob Marley's spiritual advisor throughout his life, for much of his life, and a wonderful, wise man. And he gathered a group of elders together from across Jamaica to talk about storytelling and to talk about the stories that they were centrally interested in, which is the stories in the Old Testament of the Bible, the King James Version of the Old Testament. And just as they were about to gather and Kumi came up to me and said, Brother Ted, there's one thing you should know. Some of the people here think the world is round. Some of them think the world is flat. And then he looked at me and smiled and said, same people. And it kind of caught for me the character of storytelling. We all know the world is round and know in the way we believe things. And we realize that we're really sitting right side up right now rather than upside down, which we would be sitting if the world were round, which it is. And those kinds of contradictions are at the heart of storytelling, and stories from a very early age introduce us to them and make us kind of comfortable with those contradictions, comfortable with contradictions like how sad songs can help us, make us happy, how beautiful music can make us cry. I mean, those kinds of, that's life. And stories give us a level of comfort and a level of uncertainty about how that works and what we can do. And that uncertainty is important. The stories kind of balance, give us a promise of balance between truth and belief, for example. Belief keeps us going, doubt keeps us alive, I often say, and hope keeps us human. And stories provide all of that. And they've certainly, I think, helped many of us get through COVID. The sense of company we had with other people going through the same thing, and the stories that came out of it, not all of them, of course, happy stories, but stories often aren't. And they kind of give us that level of comfort in company, in stories, is extraordinarily important. Oscar Wilde used to say that the people he knew best were people in stories. He also used to say they were the people he liked most, too.